Welcome to the Niehaus cabin. In 1839, Kari and Kittel Niehaus came from Norway to the United States. They came by the boat Emily to New York, and from there they took smaller boats and wagons to Chicago. When they got to Chicago, they found out that Kari's brother Oli Natesta had moved to Boone County and that he had a cabin and land. So they came here and they stayed with them until they bought a farm in Clinton, Wisconsin, and started their family there. They purchased some land in Illinois in 1846, and that is the land that this cabin came from. Now, we don't know if they built this cabin or if the person they sold the land to in 1849 built the cabin, but on the land grant, it said that Kittel and Kari sold the land with tenements. Tenements means there were structures on the property. So that either they built it or the person after them built the cabin. It's built from bur oak logs, and bur oak is a white oak, and it's very, very strong, and it resists rot. So you figure how old this cabin is and that it still looks as good as it does. We were very fortunate that they used the bur oak because there aren't many sections that rotted. It was moved to this property in 1989 in February. They moved it in February because they thought they could get it out, that the ground would be frozen, it would be safe. Well, on that day, the sun was shining and the ground, actually, the top layer of the ground started to turn into mud. So the truck got stuck and the cabin actually started to move, and they thought they were going to lose it. So they quickly ran, got wood and everything, propped it up, and got back on the road and had a tow truck and everything. But they got it here. And when they got it here, a lot of it was in pieces, and they had to actually rebuild it in place. And they had numbered everything when they left the original site, and they put it all back together. We had a volunteer who did all the work. He put in the chinking, and he rebuilt the windows and things like that. Now, this cabin would have originally been built just a single structure here. It would not have had this addition on it. The addition came later when the family got more money and got established. They would add on. They would also not have had glass windows, but as they got to be more prosperous farmers, they would splurge and buy glass. That helped keep insects out, keep the weather out, because there were many times when settlers used to wake up in the morning with snow on their beds because it would sift through every little crack and crevice in the cabin. They would not have originally had a porch, but that would have come later. There were as many as 12 to 14 people who lived in this cabin. Norwegian families had huge amounts of children. And whenever someone came from the old country to the United States, they would stay with a family member until they could build their own cabin. And so you might have 10 people from your own family living there, and then you might have an extra 6 or 7 or 8 or however many extra people who came. We can go inside the cabin and I can show you what we're working on today. Inside the cabin, you notice that the ceilings are very high, and Norwegians built log cabins in Norway, and so they had more skill at building the cabins, and they knew to be roomy, they needed a little taller ceiling. Originally, the windows would have been smaller because they would have just been a hole. They didn't want too much space, but once they added the glass, they might have started with a half of a window, and then as they got more money, they would have gone down to make it more airy. The walls are whitewashed. They would do that to bring light because it does get very dark with the wood in a cabin. So the whitewash is actually a mixture of lime, salt, and water. So they mix the lime and the water and they add the salt. The salt helps keep the paint on the walls. The one problem with that is the lime always wants to sink to the bottom of the water. So some people would add molasses to the mixture, and the molasses would help suspend the lime so it didn't settle as quickly, so that if they wanted to paint, they didn't have to paint as fast and they could be more accurate. It really helps to brighten up the space, and then you're not wasting your candles and things when you're working inside. During the summer, you would do a lot of your working outside. Here in the fall, it's starting to cool off, and what I'm doing is every community had a healer, and I would be considered the healer in that area, so my job was to collect the herbs and plants that would be used for medicine. Every family would have their own things that they use, teas and things like that, but if something more serious came, they would go to a healer. There weren't doctors in the area, and even if there were, they did not trust them, because in Norway, doctors were someone that only the wealthiest people could have advantage to, and so even in Norway, they had local healers. So today I've been collecting some herbs, and these are the ones that would be used the most. The first herb that would be really important to the Norwegians is angelica. Angelica was considered one of their best herbs. They used it for many different things. Scurvy, it has a lot of vitamin C. So if there weren't a lot of fresh fruits and things available in the winter, sometimes the people would get scurvy, which is a vitamin C deficiency, and so angelica helped with that. It was also very good for stomach issues, and they used it for flavoring foods because it has kind of an anise flavor, and it was also used to help sweeten fruits. So I have some dried raspberries over there, and when I would go in the winter to make jelly with them, I would dry them in the summer because they wouldn't last, and I didn't have a lot of jars and things to use. So I would dry them, and then the angelica would be added to help sweeten them, because when they're dried, they aren't as sweet. They lose some of the sweetness. Some of the other herbs that would be used is lavender. Lavender was one that's been used for generations. It was used for the scent. It smells wonderful. And it was used to make food, to give it flavor. They would use it in cookies and breads and things. But the reason they would use it medicinally in a tea was for migraine headaches. It actually calms the mind, and it cools off the headache. And it's also used in sleep pillows, along with mugwort and hops for sleeping. So they would put the dried herb mixture in a bag, and then you'd slip it under the pillow, and at night it would help you relax so you could fall asleep and have good dreams. Thyme was used for flavoring food, but it was also used because it has antibacterial properties. So they would make a mixture of alcohol and the thyme, and they would use it to wash things. They didn't really know about germs, but they knew about cleanliness, so they would use it to wipe down things, because there were a lot of times that they would have illnesses that were caused by germs. They didn't know what a germ was. They just knew if they did this, it would help. Parsley was used to help flavor foods. It doesn't really have a flavor, but what it does is it enhances the other foods. So the flavor of the other foods comes out more. They didn't have a lot of access to salt and pepper sometimes, so this was used to help bring out the food flavors. This is another important herb, and this is elderberry. And they believe that the elderberry bush had a spirit. It was a woman's spirit. And before you could pick the elderberry, you had to ask permission of the woman of the plant. It's actually a big bush. And if you didn't, you would have leg problems for the rest of the year. So it was very important to ask permission. And the elderberries are dried to use for teas later. And this is elderberry syrup that I make every year. And it's used for flus and colds, and it helps keep the illness away. And it's made with honey, elderberry, and cloves. Cloves were used to preserve. So cloves were used for flavor in foods, but it's also a preservative, and it keeps things from getting moldy. So this is added to this, gives it a good flavor, and you can keep this out. You don't have to refrigerate it or anything because they didn't have refrigeration. It was cold in Norway, so they did, but in the summer they had to think of other ways, so that was one of the ways they did it. This looks like cookies or biscuits, but it's actually a yeast cake. And this was made using hops. So hops were used for ale, and they were also used in the sleep pillows to relax the mind. But when you make a tea of hops, the wild yeast is attracted to the tea, and then you add a mashed up potato, and the yeast feeds on that, and then it starts to grow. And once it starts to grow, you add corn flour or meal, and you make these cakes. You dry them until they're really hard and crumbly, and then you can keep them all year round. And anytime you want to make bread, you get this wet and let it sit for overnight, and it'll start the yeast to grow again, and that's what you use to leaven your bread. This bread I made last night because I knew that people were coming to visit. This is barley bread. When Norwegians came to the United States, wheat was what was available. They asked for seeds of barley from home because barley was their favorite bread to use. So this is barley flour, and it's actually kind of has the consistency of cornmeal. And then this is the cleaned barley. This would have been soaked overnight, and then this is soaked for about an hour before you make the bread, and then you add this soaked barley with this, and you add some of the yeast that I've put in the hot water, and then you bake your bread. And it turns out it's called brandbraden, and it's a brown bread. But it's a flavor from home, and they loved it. This was something that was special. Juniper was very important. Juniper was used for stomach ailments also, and the berries were used to help gamey foods taste less gamey, and they also burned the juniper to keep away witches. If you had bad cases of pneumonia going around, everyone knew that you would slice up onions and add some sugar, and the sugar has been taken off the cone, and you would boil it overnight at a slow simmer on the stove, and then the next morning you would put it on the person's chest as a plaster. So they would take the sugar and onion mix and lay it on their chest, and then put a wet cloth over it and let it sit on there, and it works to help bring up all of the phlegm that's in the chest, and then that would help them heal. Yarrow was very important for wounds. Yarrow is a plant that they would use as a poultice. A poultice is just a mash of the herbs with a little liquid. So this is used to staunch bleeding in a wound. If you have a cut and it won't stop bleeding, you just make a poultice of the leaves of the yarrow and you pack it in the wound and it will stop the bleeding. There's a chemical in it. The Native American tribes in the United States all use it too for that reason. They also make a tea of yarrow, and the tea of yarrow was used for colds and things like that. This is catmint. Catmint is a very important herb for urinary infections, urinary stones. They would make a tea and it would help the stones pass, or it would help strengthen the urinary tract. And plantain is another one that was important to use for wounds. So plantain, the leaves was made into a poultice, and it was also used in salves. And they would make salves because then they would have something to use in the winter. Plantain is thought to draw out the poisons that are in a wound, and that would help the wound heal faster. And it would also keep you from blood poisoning. That was their belief. And it has been proven. This is a salve. This is called a black salve. It's very potent and pungent. Everybody had their own secret black salve, but what it was used for was to draw out a blister if it had infection inside of it. It could take out a sliver that was infected in your skin. It would help to draw that out. And this was a very important thing. Everybody had their secret formula, and people would come far and wide to get some of this from you if yours was the best. And this is mullein. And mullein was very important to the Norwegians. And when it came to the United States, the Native Americans also started using it. So the leaves get huge, and they were used to put on wounds because it's very soft and comforting. The leaves were dried and smoked for asthma, which seems kind of contradictory, and now we know it's probably not a good idea, but back then they knew that mullein helped soothe the lungs, so they thought the fastest way to get it there was to smoke it. That probably made things worse. So this is dried mullein. It's very soft, it's very light, and it's used for making teas. The flowers were actually used in oil for earaches. And so you would soak them in the oil, and then you would strain it out, and you would just need a couple drops for an earache. And so this would last probably a whole year. So these are the things that they found really important to help keep their families safe and healthy. When doctors became more available, at first they were very reluctant. So a lot of the Lutheran ministers and their wives were actually trained in some of the medical practices when they came here, because they had gone to school, and so they knew that they didn't trust the doctors. The common folk didn't trust the doctors, so they actually trained the ministers to help with some of the medical things. Well, thank you for coming to the Niehaus cabin. Actually, when they got here, they changed their name to the translation, which means new house. So they became Kittle and Kari Niehaus, and that was, at the time of their death, that was what they were known as, the Niehaus family. My name is Pam Stock. I am interpreting the cabin today for the Boone County Conservation District, and thank you for coming.